They found it on a quiet night, a cold fleck of motion cutting across the stars. It didn't announce itself. It didn't roar. It just arrived. An interstellar stranger with no return address, a traveller from a story older than our sun. The data looked ordinary at first, the way a tide seems harmless before it pulls you under. Then came the line, thin, stubborn, undeniable, pointing not just through our neighbourhood, but toward the blue world we call home. Scientists don't scare easily, numbers don't shake. But when the numbers kept saying the same thing, a question began to spread like frost. What if Earth is the final target of 3i Atlas? It doesn't belong here, and that's the first thing everyone agrees on. The orbit solution refuses to close into a neat ellipse. It stays open like a door left ajar to winter. The numbers say hyperbolic, coming from elsewhere, going to elsewhere, and the fit only gets sharper as more data lands on the table. We try to place it in a family, a clan, a well-worn pathway around the sun, but there's no ancestry to consult. No gentle genealogy of comets that return every few decades with predictable theatrics. 3i Atlas is a traveller with no forwarding address, the kind of object that forces us to admit how often we mistake familiarity for safety. The first observations are the most humble, faint smudges blinking along a path barely above the noise. Technicians cull bad pixels, subtract dark frames, and stack the sky until the signal walks forward out of the grain. It moves just enough to be alive, and with each subsequent night the line we draw through those points hardens into a statement. We make the usual corrections: parallax, proper motion, Earth's own lurch through space, and still the trajectory hums the same tune. Inbound fast, outbound faster, a razor slicing the ecliptic at an angle that doesn't care about our schedules. The eccentricity refuses to be reasonable. The fit whispers, "Not from here." From the start, 3i Atlas teaches a lesson that makes professionals feel like beginners again. Provenance matters. An interstellar origin isn't just a curiosity, it's a warning label. Our defences, our models, our sense of how these things behave. We're trained on local fauna, icy bodies raised in the Oort cloud, disciplined by the slow geometry of our own sun. A visitor from beyond doesn't owe us those manners. Its composition may not conform to our expectations of how volatile ices sublimate, how dust grains scatter light, how a nucleus cracks under heat. The sublimation curve we thought was universal turns into a question mark, and with that question, our predictions wobble. We point bigger eyes at it because that's what you do when something won't explain itself. Spectrographs nose around for the faintest signatures. Cyanogen, diatomic carbon, water bands breathing in the glare. Some nights the coma seems to wake, a veil of material blooming just enough to tease, and then it goes thin again, withholding. If the outgassing is lopsided, it will push. If sunlight pokes the right weak spot, jets will whisper, and those whispers compound into a nudge that grows into a course change we don't fully own. With local comets, we've learned the quirks. With 3i Atlas, every measurement stretches a new canvas. Photometry tells another half-truth. The light curve flickers with a period that might be rotation, or tumble, or shape. If it's long and thin, a spindle, the cross-section we see will modulate as it spins. If it's stubby and jagged, the signal will jitter. We try to pull a shape out of brightness like a sculptor pulling a face out of marble, but the chisel is blunt and the marble is distant. Occultation plans go up on whiteboards. Can we convince a speck of rock to blot a distant star for a fraction of a second, at precisely the moment our instruments are watching? Can we stand in the right shadow on Earth and measure a silhouette that travelled for eons to cross us? Most of the time, the sky says no and we go back to the pixels. What unnerves the room is the clock. Interstellar objects don't meander, they sprint. The luxury of years-long pre-discovery arcs isn't on offer. We can't rummage through archival plates and rescue a ghost image from a decade ago, the way we sometimes can with friendly slow neighbours. From first detection to perihelion, we count in weeks and months, not seasons. Every hour of weather lost becomes a chunk of uncertainty that won't come back. Telescope time is a currency and the sky's a marketplace. Compete. Beginning, prioritize. Trade. Someone decides what star dies, what galaxy is ignored, so that our small world might buy a tighter ellipse. And then there is the line. No matter how many times we recalibrate, reweight and refit, a particular geometry returns like a refrain. The inbound track slices through the plane of Earth's orbit in a way that forces us to think about timing. The words final target aren't scientific, not exactly. They're human, but they're useful because they offend our habit of detachment. If the node crossing and our position happen to coincide, final target stops being a metaphor. A near miss at the speed of a thrown planet is not a courtesy. It's a test of infrastructure, agriculture, politics, and luck. A handful of days forward or back could move the encounter point by millions of kilometers, or, unhappily, not enough. At the edges of the model, small forces grow teeth. Outgassing can torque the body, and torque can realign the jets, and the realignment can alter the torque again. A feedback loop that turns a pebble push into a meaningful delta V. Sunlight itself is not innocent. Radiation pressure can bully dust, and if the bulk density is low, or the surface is strangely porous, that pressure might start to play in the big leagues. Back in the safe world of textbooks, we call these non-gravitational accelerations, as if we've tamed them with a label. In practice, they are the unknowns that widen impact corridors and make deflection strategies feel like trying to swat a mosquito in the dark by listening for the buzz. The drama isn't only dynamical, it's philosophical. We are used to thinking of our solar system as home and everything beyond as the wilderness. 3I Atlas collapses that border. Its atoms were assembled under a different sun, or in the cold between suns, then folded by other planets, or none at all, and finally hurled out by an event we may never reconstruct. A close pass, a chain reaction of perturbations, a catastrophic breakup that turned a sibling world into shrapnel. When it arrives here, we're given a once-in-a-civilization postcard from the wider galaxy. The same postcard might be written on stone, so we inventory what we might lose and what we might learn. Dust tails are archives of chemistry, nuclei are relics of beginnings. If we could approach, we could taste isotopes, read the ratios that whisper about ancient stellar forges and interstellar iceboxes. But approach isn't a verb we get to use casually at tens of kilometers per second. The mission profiles we practiced on domestic comets feel like slow dances. This is a chase scene with a closing door. Even if we launched yesterday, would we have the delta V to match, to sample, to nudge? The honest answer is that the engineering has to run as fast as the math, and both are panting. Meanwhile, the story on Earth is painfully practical. Insurance models ask about airbursts, reservoir managers ask about ashen watersheds, grid operators ask about transformers and sky glow and demand spikes. Farmers ask about the kind of summer that follows a dim spring. City planners ask what an evacuation means when every route is an argument and every hour is a rumour. These are not hysterics. They are the discipline of people whose job is to say, if this slice of the probability pie is real, what breaks first? In that meeting, 3I Atlas is neither an omen nor a headline. It's a decision tree. And still, strange beauty keeps intruding. On clear nights, when the object rises just enough to be seen, a team that has been calculating worst-case scenarios will stop and simply look. A dot moving against the constellations, a suggestion of a tail, the faintest gauze around a core. This is what a messenger looks like when it's still far enough away to be abstract. For a minute, even the word target dissolves, and what remains is the older truth. We live in a sky that sends us things, and sometimes those things are lessons and sometimes they are bills. What makes the rooms go quiet is not certainty, it's its opposite. We're good at stories with second acts, detect, characterize, mitigate. 3i Atlas threatens to compress those acts into one breath. The past is unknowable, the present is noisy, the future is racing, and in the empty space between one dataset and the next, the model's corridor to Earth refuses to die. It narrows, widens, shifts, steadies, never quite collapsing, never quite escaping. In that tension, the object becomes a mirror. We see a civilization that builds telescopes big enough to catch whispers and bureaucracies slow enough to miss shouts. We see a species that can throw metal at the moon and still debate whether to fund more eyes on the dark. We see how a planet becomes a final target, not because the universe chooses it, but because it happens to be there, soft and blue, circling on schedule. If there is fear, it is the kind that sharpens. It trims irrelevancies. It asks for more data, more nights, more hands on the dome and more minds on the code. It remembers that the unknown can be both wonder and hazard, sometimes within the same paragraph. And it holds without apology two truths at once. 3i Atlas is a gift from beyond our borders, and it is also a test arriving on its own clock. Between those truths we keep watching. We keep fitting. We keep telling ourselves that humility is not the same as helplessness, because if the line does not look away, we will need every good habit we've ever learned. On the first night the line was tentative, like a pencil stroke that could still be erased. By the fourth, it had hardened into ink. No matter how the team cut the data, drop the noisiest frames, promote the cleanest astrometry, give more weight to the northern sights, then the southern. The plotted path insisted on threading a familiar circle, the highway where Earth keeps its appointments. The software shows it as a thin filament gliding across a pale blue ring. Outside the program, people call it what it feels like, the line that won't look away. The ritual becomes muscle memory. Pull fresh measurements from the queue, clean the outliers, recompute the orbit, watch the residuals shrink until they refuse to. Someone says, run the clones, and 1,000 virtual versions of 3i Atlas bloom in the server like a shoal of fish. Each clone is the same story with one word changed, the tiny errors in our measurements swollen into full personalities. Then the propagation begins, forward in time, past the nodal crossings, through the calendar pages that belong to us. On the plot their paths spray outward, a comet tail of possibilities. Most sweep wide. Some glance the orbit of Mars or stutter near Venus and move on. But a stubborn fraction march across Earth's track on the very days our world will be there. In the quiet that follows, everyone hears the same unspoken sentence. Probabilities are not comfort. The geometry is rude in its simplicity. The plane of Earth's motion is a sheet of glass. The track of 3i Atlas is a needle that pierces it. Whether the needle meets glass where we stand depends on timing, a handful of hours decided by tiny forces. So we go hunting for those forces. Is there jetting? On stacked images, the coma sometimes shows lopsided glow, a suggestion that one hemisphere is breathing harder than the other. If a jet is angled just so, the non-gravitational push adds a whisper of acceleration along track. That whisper becomes a minute of early arrival, then 2, then 5. 5 minutes at interstellar speeds is not an inconvenience. It is continents. Numbers we treat as tame suddenly gain fangs. The minimum orbit intersection distance, MOID, slides in updates like a heartbeat on a monitor. The covariance ellipse, that polite shape that says, "Here be uncertainty," starts long and skinny like a ribbon laid along the trajectory, then rotates in ways that make planners reach for stronger coffee. Cross-track uncertainty we can live with. A long-track uncertainty is the one that courts us. It turns the plot into an exercise in dread. You can be off by a little and still be exactly wrong. We try to make the line look away with better seeing, better calibration, better nights. We call in additional stations, convince a telescope on a mountain to steal a few minutes from a scheduled galaxy survey. Someone dispatches a small radar facility to ping the nucleus if geometry allows. Even a whisper of a return could pin down the distance like a thumb on a map. But the clock is miserly. The window for radar is thin, the object faint, the rotation unknown. We build strategies and watch the weather laugh. Inside the trajectory group, a whiteboard blooms with hand-drawn corridors. If outgassing follows a Lambertian pattern, if it's jet-dominated, if the nucleus is monolithic, if it's a rubble pile, one corridor bows away from us and everyone breathes for a minute, another bows toward us and the room tightens again. Someone sketches gravitational keyholes, those narrow, invisible alleys where a close path steers future paths like a tap on a pinball, but then crosses them out. This visitor is a one-time guest. There will be no second act. If it comes, it comes. If it misses, it vanishes into the long dark and takes our questions with it. We preach discipline to ourselves, trust the data, distrust the drama. Yet drama keeps walking back in on its own legs. When the clone cloud overlays Earth's orbit, the densest part, the place where many futures agree, overlaps the calendar day we do not want. It's a sliver, a fingernail's crescent, an unimpressive statistic. But the Earth is not a statistic. It is a habitat with oceans stacked like fuel and skies that carry shock for 1,000 miles. The risk matrices we draft are ordinary tools. The consequences they gesture at are not ordinary. Each new night of measurements is an argument with fate. On good nights, the astrometric scatter tightens and the corridor narrows away from us. On bad nights, thin clouds smear the stars and the fit loosens just enough that the corridor thickens over the blue ring again. We learn the emotional weather of the staff by how they stand at the plotter. The ones who lean in, arms crossed and jaw set. The ones who hover in the doorway, neither entering nor leaving like a superstition. At some point, a young analyst stops calling it the object and starts calling it 3-Eye Atlas, as if naming it makes the line more honest. The public-facing team drafts and redrafts a single paragraph for the world. We have detected a new interstellar object. Its current trajectory carries a non-zero probability of Earth encounter on date. The temptation to soften is strong. The temptation to shout is also strong. We split the difference and tell the truth with numbers, which is the least satisfying way to tell the truth. Inside, the risk isn't a headline. It's the shape of the corridor, the way it refuses to break eye contact. We look for refuge in physics we understand. Gravitational focusing, Earth drawing paths inward like a lens, expands the effective cross-section of risk. Lunar perturbations complicate it further. The Moon's position could nudge an approach by kilometres, and kilometres at these speeds can toggle harmless to historic. Upper atmosphere density models come out of their folders, because a tangent graze might become a high-altitude airburst if the object is fragile enough. We are not planning, we tell ourselves, only exploring. And yet the exploration keeps circling the same sentence. If Earth is the final target, what does it mean to be ready? Some nights the model suggests a narrow window where a small change, centimetres per second delivered weeks in advance, would push the corridor off our ring. That kind of change is within human reach. It is also a dare. A kinetic nudge risks turning one bullet into buckshot. An ablative push requires proximity we have never achieved at this speed. We sketch mission timelines on napkins anyway. Every option is a knife we have not yet learned to hold by the right end. The astronomers who spend their lives in uncertainties develop rituals for sanity. They keep a log of every refit, every altered weight, every time a measurement is promoted or demoted, and why. They teach the newcomers that the first solution is a liar, and the fourth is a gossip, and the eighth might be a friend. They keep separate the words danger and attention, reserving the first for when the math leaves no room. And they allow themselves, once a night, to walk outside and look up at the sky that keeps sending exams. The line on the screen intersects more than orbits, it slices through departments. Atmospheric scientists ask about dust loads and their effect on monsoon patterns. power grid engineers model geomagnetically quiet skies going suddenly loud with ionization from an airburst. Maritime agencies sketch tsunami profiles if the line tilts toward ocean. Aviation planners run reroutes as thought experiments. Psychologists circulate memos about messaging that informs while sparing panic. The world, it turns out, has an entire architecture for maybe it is creaky, but it exists. In the lab, we try to box the unknowable with better priors. The light curve suggests a rotation period, which hints at moments of inertia, which informs how torques from jets translate to trajectory shifts. Spectral lines suggest volatile mixes, which suggest how the thrust evolves with distance from the sun. Each inference is a stepping stone across a river we don't want to fall into. Some stones wobble, some sink. We keep going because the opposite is to stand on the bank while the flood rises. There is an indignity in how little the universe needs to move the line. A patch of dark on the surface that absorbs more heat, a seam that opens a day earlier than expected, a spin state that couples to sunlight just so. These are not dramatic causes, they are ordinary, but ordinary at interstellar speeds is a weapon. We learn to fear adjectives like slight and minor when they sit next to trajectory. Every update carries a twin hope that the corridor will peel away from our ring, and that if it doesn't, we will be better for having watched it so closely. One hope is tender, the other is steel. The tender hope belongs to the child in us that wants the sky to be kind. The steel hope belongs to the adult who understands that kindness is not guaranteed and preparation is not optional. When the plot refuses, again, to look away, both hopes stand there together and do not argue. In the end, the line is only a line, a visualization of calculus, a trace of photons turned into positions, turned into futures. It has no intent, it has no eyes, the won't look away is ours, a projection, a metaphor for how it keeps returning to the same uncomfortable overlap with our lives. But metaphors have their uses. They remind us to keep the file open, to keep borrowing time from other projects, to keep persuading telescopes and people to spare just one more night. Because with 3i Atlas, the difference between a miss and a mark might be hidden in the next half hour of clean stars, so we keep drawing it, we keep watching it. We keep learning the language of a stranger's motion well enough to whisper, perhaps, a counter-argument at the right moment. And if that moment never arrives because the line at last bends away, we will still have gained the quiet knowledge that the next time a line refuses to look away, we will recognise the stare sooner and meet it with steadier hands. Earth is not a protagonist chosen by the cosmos. It is a place that happens to be in the way. That truth is not cruel. It is clarifying. It tells us why the plot matters, why the screen matters, why the patient work of shrinking a corridor by inches can protect a world measured in millions of miles. Speed is not simply a number on a plot. It is a policy, a philosophy, a limit on what we can dream of doing in the time we have left. 3i Atlas arrives with the kind of velocity that turns comfortable plans into museum pieces. Warning time collapses. The leisurely cadence of observe, analyze, convene, decide, launch compresses until each verb is stepping on the heels of the one before it. The sky does not slow down because we are deliberating. It does not circle back for a better meeting. At interstellar speeds, every hour we spend becoming certain is an hour we may be spending wrong. The first casualty of speed is seeing. Early on, when the object is still far and faint, we can gather long exposures and tease out a signal. But as 3i Atlas barrels inward, the angular rate climbs. Exposure times must shrink or the target will smear into a streak, and with shorter exposures comes less light, and with less light comes noisier measurements. The very act of trying to look harder makes the picture fuzzier. Telescopes chase. Mount drives whir against their limits, and pointing software that was designed for sedate neighbours begins to stutter. What we want is exquisite astrometry. What we get is the best we can wrestle from physics and weather before the clock clips our fingers. Radar, the old truth teller, is not easily impressed either. To lock on, we need geometry and time. The object must be close enough for a whisper to bounce and return, and we must know where to aim the whisper. With 3-eye atlas, the window is narrow and the range rate is brutal. Doppler spreads the echo, the signal dives into the noise, and a missed night is not tomorrow's problem. It is a permanent hole in the record. We sketch plans for a monostatic ping here, a bistatic catch there, and hope the ionosphere behaves. Speed, with its dry smile, reminds us that hope is not an instrument. From sensing to steering, the story only tightens. Deflection is an art that rewards the early. Give a slow-moving rock a nudge far from Earth, and the nudge flowers into safety by the time it matters. But 3-eye atlas does not grant us that kind of gardening. With weeks instead of years, centimetres per second of delta V start to look like a dream told in daylight. A kinetic impactor that would have been elegant at domestic speeds becomes a circus act at this pace. Guidance needs a lock on a small, possibly tumbling target. Navigation tolerances shrink to knife edges. The closing velocity turns seconds into syllables. Even success could be complicated. Momentum transfer depends on surface and structure, on whether we hit armour or ash, monolith or rubble, and we will not know which until the moment after it matters. Then there is ablation. Shine enough energy on one side, let vaporized material act like a jet. Conceptually neat, practically merciless. You need dwell time, tight pointing, and power. High speed steals the first, distance steals the second, and engineering reality steals the third. Bring the energy source closer, and you inherit the guidance problem again. Keep it far, and the beam fattens, its authority melts away. The method works best when the universe is patient. 3-eye atlas does not do patient. People whisper about the word no one wants on a public slide, nuclear. Not as a storybook explosion, but as a standoff pulse to couple energy into a surface and make thrust where, 5 minutes ago, there was only ice and shadow. It is the fastest way to deliver a lot of go away when time is thin. It is also a road paved with politics, treaties, testing gaps, and the same composition riddles as everything else. Fragile objects fragment. Dense objects shrug. In one branch of the decision tree we avert a bullseye. In another, we trade one target for a smear of smaller ones, each with their own appointment. Speed forces us to contemplate options we hate on timelines we hate more. The launch problem is its own weather system. Plans built for decades assumed we would have months to integrate, test, and roll a mission to the pad. 3-eye atlas arrives like a pop quiz. What matters now is what is already fueled, already checked out, already in a hangar we can open today. Launch windows become the boss. A missed orbital plane or an outdated ephemeris means the rocket lifts to meet a ghost. We discover, again, that aerospace is where calendars go to be humbled. The best trajectory might be a direct, brutal ascent with little forgiveness. The clever gravity assist we'd love to brag about is a trick for people who can wait. Even if steel leaves Earth on time, guidance wrestles with a target that does not care to make the job easy. High closing speeds punish errors with contempt. Terminal navigation demands a picture that stays crisp when everything in it is rushing toward you. Seekers must discriminate a dim, dusty core from the cold brightness of starfields, from the glare of sun off a thin coma, from noise pretending to be truth. The control loop must be quick enough to bite without chewing itself into oscillation. In simulations it works. In flight it works if the universe feels like conceding. Speed is the universe's way of charging a fee for arrogance. We say wisely that civil defense is always part of planetary defense. But speed even taxes the ground. A risk corridor at interstellar pace sweeps across continents in hours. A long-track uncertainty can shift a projected ground track by an ocean while we're still arguing about phrasing. Telling a city to move is hard. Telling a chain of cities that the corridor might be over them, or might not, is something else. Will the sea be the final cushion, or the amplifier? Will the mountains shadow or funnel the shock? Which air routes should arc away? Which grids should brace for blinks? Evacuation plans are excellent documents until uncertainty and velocity ride together onto the same page. Meanwhile, our capacity for decision moves at the speed of institutions. A detection can be made by a graduate student after midnight. A launch authorization moves through rooms with carpets. The chain is long. Verification, replication, interagency call, international coordination, export controls, funding taps, range safety, weather, go, no go. Each link is defensible. The product is delay. In a world where seconds are short, minutes are expensive and days are luxuries, governance becomes a performance art measured in delta V for gone. This is not an indictment. It is a design constraint we pretend not to have. 3i Atlas annotates the pretense in red ink. One of the most treacherous effects of speed is emotional. It makes perfection seductive. When the ground is moving, the mind says, wait for one more data set. Tighten the corridor. Push the error bars down. Sometimes that is wisdom. Sometimes it is cowardice in a lab coat. Speed punishes the difference. A decision taken with 70% confidence while action is still possible can be better than a decision taken with 95% confidence after the last useful window has fallen shut. We do not train well for that kind of courage. We prefer the safety of being right to the risk of being on time. And yet, if Earth is truly the final target, speed is not only a threat, it is also a teacher. It teaches us to pre-stage, to design interceptors that can sit cold and ready, without a bespoke berth each time a headline breaks. To build survey eyes that reduce the domain of surprise, looking low in twilight near the sun's glare, from poles and Lagrange points, so that weeks becomes months. And months are enough for sane humans to do clever human things. It teaches us to practice joint rehearsals as if the script were already in circulation. Astronomers, mission designers, communications, civil authorities, and the quiet hands who turn wrenches and make miracles obey calendars. Speed also clarifies our appetite for risk. If fragmentation is worse than a strike, we must know it before we choose a hammer. If a nudge now averts a cloud later, we must have the institutional spine to nudge without the comfort of unanimity. If messaging can keep people informed without feeding panic, we must write those sentences on blue sky days and keep them in a drawer so we are not inventing vocabulary while the sky glows. There is, buried in the terror, a kind of awe. Speed means 3i Atlas has been riding a straight line through the dark for longer than our languages have existed. It means that whatever sent it, gravity's long casino, a broken family of worlds, a shiver in a distant nursery, launched a message that just happens to be crossing ours now. If its path ends here, it will not be because it chose us. It will be because time and geometry conspire to make our planet the place where its story writes its last sentence. That is bleak only if we insist on being bystanders in our own chapter. So we cut away what we cannot change and meet what we can. We make the sensors faster and the pipelines shorter. We pre-agree on thresholds that trigger action without a referendum. We stash hardware in hangars and software in machines that are bored, eager to wake. We blur the boundaries between science and response, so the handoff feels like muscle memory instead of novelty. And we promise, privately at least, to choose the good enough action when the perfect one is a ghost. Because when an interstellar object moves this fast, the universe is not being cruel, it is being itself. We can bargain with budgets and process. We cannot bargain with kilometers per second. In the nights ahead, the plots will keep updating. The residuals will dance, the corridors will lean away from us, then back. Like a tide we can almost predict. The truth we practice in those hours is simple. Speed is the shape of our problem. Readiness is the shape of our answer. If 3i Atlas is indeed drawing a straight line to the only blue world we have, then the only honest reply is to become quicker in all the ways that matter. Eyes, hands, institutions, and will. So that when the sky writes fast, Earth does not read slow. There is a comforting lie in the singular. One object, one strike, one crater, one story you can fold and file. But the sky, like history, prefers plurals. The most unnerving possibility is not a clean hit. It is a shattering, one body turning into a storm. 3-Eye Atlas carries that possibility inside it, the way a seed carries a forest. Fragility is not mercy. A brittle nucleus can spare you a single bullseye and still leave you with a map of injuries that stretch across latitudes and months. It starts invisibly. Stress lines thread the core as sunlight licks one hemisphere and cold clamps the other. Sublimation vents open and close like gills, each jet a tiny engine that torques the spin, a spin that re-aims the jets, a feedback loop tracing invisible scars. Maybe there's an old fracture from the system that birthed it, or from a near miss far away, or from nothing more dramatic than uneven heat. Then, at the wrong angle near the wrong warmth, the right seam fails. Not an explosion, more like a sigh that turns into gravel. The single track on our plots becomes a braid of tracks, each with its own small ambition. The physics of many is cruel to modellers. A monolith obeys more or less. A flock argues with itself. Pebble-sized fragments feel sunlight like a shove. Boulders remember their inertia. Dust becomes a veil that hides the very things we most need to measure. Some pieces flare without gassing and push themselves off the family's main road. Others go inert and dark, their albedo the colour of the void, radar small, telescope faint, lives spared by being too tough to glow. The clone cloud we were running on servers now needs sub-clones and sub-sub-clones. Computational budgets creak in sympathy. What was a single corridor across Earth's orbit becomes an unfurling ribbon with ragged edges and threads that whip in the solar wind. You could be lucky and watch the biggest chunk miss the planet by a comfortable distance. You could be lucky and still absorb the rest. Airbursts are headline averse until they are not. When a stony fragment meets the thickening air at tens of kilometres a second, it does not politely plough. It couples energy to atmosphere in an instant, a fist that becomes a fever. The shock front peels outward at supersonic pride, overpressure swatting glass from windows, rattling structures, ringing the planet in infrasonic tones that a child will not notice and a barometer will. If a fragment breaks high, you get a lantern in the noon sky and a shower of snow-like dust. If it holds longer, the punch lands lower, and roofs remember that they were designed for weather, not physics. Buildings do not care for nuance. They are engineered for wind loads and earthquakes, perhaps even for the sulk of a nearby volcano, if their builders were cautious. Very few are built for a sky that insults them from above over a footprint wider than a city. A mosaic of low-altitude bursts across a continent can blow out hospitals and schools with equal indifference, fill emergency rooms and then steal their windows, break the grid and then demand it. Even if the land is spared a crater, the supply chains are not spared a season. Smelters and semiconductor fabs like clean air and steady power. Shocked skies and blinking grids teach them new languages. Ocean does not guarantee forgiveness. It negotiates different terms. A fragment that reaches sea will wrap itself in steam and roaring, and a column of water and air that despises calm. The wave it spawns is not the long-rolling, earthquake-born swell of a tectonic tsunami. It is shorter, steeper, and treacherous. The kind that spends itself quickly in the deep, but finds cruelty in continental shelves and bays. Harbours will resonate. River mouths will funnel. Low-lying deltas will learn what amplification means. The first wave is not always the worst. People who thought they had learned the rhythm from other disasters will be surprised by how this song is scored. Multiple marine impacts write a different nightmare. Harbours are our lungs for trade. Drown a handful in one busy ocean and the world coughs. Fuel does not arrive. Food arrives in the wrong places. Insurance markets blink, then stare, then start redrawing their maps with cold pens. Even far from water, factory lines slow, then pause, then find that a single missing component, stamped in a city no one but a procurement officer could place on a globe, has become the governor on productivity. In boardrooms and farmhouses, the phrase "final target" suddenly means the quiet math of inventory, not just the loud math of physics. The atmosphere, so often our shield, becomes our archive. Dust from a fragmented visitor is less dramatic than soot from a planet-wide fire, but it has opinions about light. Large particles fall fast and make sunsets photographers will call holy. The right-size grains, lofted by the right-size bursts, burrow into the stratosphere where rain cannot evict them. There they learn patience and the art of meddling. They scatter sunlight on its way down and thermal radiation on its way out, dimming days and chilling nights just enough to be both arguable and devastating. Not everywhere, not evenly. Weather is a mosaic, so is agriculture. The monsoon shifts a little, the jet stream meanders a little. A band of temperate farms misses a ripening window by a week that might as well be a mile. Wildfire risk listens to this, so do rivers. A cooler, duller summer in one region saves woodlands and frustrates vines. A drier, windier one thousands of kilometres away drains reservoirs and sets hills alight. The dust does not care what we plant or where we ski. It lands where the sky tells it to, and the sky's in conversation with forces we do not own. The word for this isn't apocalypse, it's attrition. It does not break civilization. It rubs it raw. Tracking the many is its own warfare. Networks designed to follow singular targets must now sort a murmuration of intruders from squadrons of false alarms. To the wide-field surveyors, the sky becomes infested with moving ghosts. To the narrow-field hunters, every streak could be a real risk or a nearby satellite flashing self-importance. Radar staffs ask for time they do not have. Optical stations hoard good nights, the way mountaineers hoard oxygen. Coordination cells, hastily gelled, learn to prioritize not by size alone, but by intent encoded in orbit. Which fragments have appointments, which are bystanders, which could become either if a jet kicks on at the wrong hour. Policy buckles in plural. One clear impact corridor across one nation is a sovereignty conversation. 10 braided corridors skipping across borders like stones across a lake is a diplomatic fire drill. Whose evacuation takes precedence when neighbouring regions share roads? Which airspaces close when the hazard footprint moves faster than paper can be signed? If an intercept attempt turns shards into confetti, whose coastline inherits the consequence? Treaties were written for different anxieties. The punctuation marks do not match the sentences on our screens. Emergency managers are asked to play chess on 3 boards with one set of hands. Airburst corridors threaten cities that can move people but not buildings. Marine corridors threaten coasts where time to higher ground is a function of hills and habit. Upland corridors promise firestorms if fragments light forest during a dry year. Each plan must be delivered with humility. We are not sure. We may be wrong. We're trying to keep you safe. A citizenry that has learned to classify uncertainty as incompetence must be persuaded to act anyway. The psychology of the many is trickier than the physics. In the labs, models bloom with best intentions. Aerosol optical depths are sketched, then recalibrated. Crop models pick up the conversation, translating dimmer light and cooler mornings into yields and losses. Fisheries economists ask what happens if plankton blooms shift by a fraction, because light in the top 30 metres changes by a fraction. Aviators care about upper atmosphere ionization from burst auroras, about how radio waves will skip, about what happens when communication corridors flicker just as air corridors are most needed. Electric utilities read studies and then ask a simpler question. Do we have enough transformers in warehouses if a heatwave meets rolling blackouts meets panicked demand? A strange mercy lives in all this. Redundancy. One strike, however brutal, breaks a place and then asks the rest of the world to help. Many strikes, properly spaced and scaled, do not end the world. They exhaust it. You get the frayed resilience of a species that can do incredible things one at a time, and then learns the hard pleasure of doing many hard things at once. A dozen nations share parts, 100 towns share shelters. The grey men and women who run logistics on bad days find themselves promoted by necessity to heroes, not because they love the sky, but because they love timetables and trucks. And still, there is the possibility none of this arrives. Fragmentation could happen in a geometry that spreads the hazard wide and thin, a dusting that makes for a generation of painters and poets, and a small dip in yields we will argue about on television. The thing about the many is that it contains both extremes, cascading harm and harmless spectacle, and everything between. The preparatory wisdom is the same. Do not be surprised by either. Hold your fear in one hand and your checklists in the other. Learn to shelter in place and to move when asked. Keep the language of maybe honest and short. If Earth is the final target, then Chapter 4 of our education is the one where we stop pretending that the sky promises us simple choices. A single bullet is a story we tell children. A cloud of stones is a curriculum for adults. It asks us to harden windows without hardening hearts, to build coastal sirens that people trust enough to run when they sing, to make grids that fail gently and come back quickly, to teach field hands and pilots and hospital staffs to treat the sky like weather, capricious, survivable, demanding respect. We can make the plural less frightening. We can lace the planet with more eyes that notice early when a nucleus starts to come apart. We can pre-position mobile radar and optical units to follow flocks rather than kings. We can write agreements that say, out loud, how we will share hardware and data and guilt. We can stockpile against the long tail of small harms. Glass, plywood, transformers, seeds, vaccines, replacement parts for pumps no one thinks about until they stop. None of this is romantic. All of it is adult. And in the night, under a sky that may soon host more streaks than stars, we can practice a quieter courage, to look up and see possibility instead of doom, to remember that 3i Atlas is not a villain with a plan, it is a stone with a history. To remember that final target is a phrase we invented to shake ourselves awake, not a sentence passed by the universe. The many can be an ending. It can also be 1,000 small survivals that add up to a civilization worth keeping. We will not earn that outcome by hoping the object stays whole. We will earn it by being many ourselves, eyes, hands, minds, when the moment asks for more than one answer. The clock doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about our committees, our calendars, or our cleverness. It ticks, and in the space between ticks we decide who we are. 3i Atlas forces that decision into the open. Will we spend our limited hours buying certainty or buying options? The better answer is older than astronomy. Prepare before you must, act before you're sure, and it feels uncomfortable because it asks us to choose on purpose, not under duress. The universe will not schedule a rehearsal. We either build one or we learn live. The first choice is sight. Months of warning turn politics into planning. Weeks turn planning into theatre. That means more eyes and different ones. Wide field watchers that sweep low in twilight where dangerous orbits hide. Southern and polar stations so our maps aren't biased by where the money is. Radars that can look up as a system, not as lonely dishes. And space-based sentinels that see heat instead of sunlight, because ice and rock whisper in infrared long before they gleam. Put some at high latitudes, some at Lagrange points where day and night are concepts, not limitations. Give them autonomy to flag strangeness, without waiting for a human to sip coffee and nod. The goal is modest and radical. Turn, we noticed, from weeks into months, sometimes into a year. A few extra calendar pages change everything downstream. Sight is wasted without speed. Observation should sprint from mountaintops and spacecraft into a common pipeline that every accredited group can touch. Auto-reduce, auto-fit, auto-task. When a dot moves wrong, telescopes should receive their marching orders while the human is still asking for the login. Publish the evolving solutions in a shared signed ledger so disagreements are data, not politics. Run the clone clouds as a background hum so that when the unexpected arrives, your first answer is not spin up the servers, but look at the dashboard. Seconds to sky, minutes to models, hours to options. That is a doctrine, not a dream. Characterization isn't a luxury. It's the difference between an elegant nudge and an expensive mistake. We should prearrange a standing roster of spectrographs to sniff for ices and dust, a mobile occultation core that can deploy across continents to chase a 1-second shadow, and a radar network that knows who hands off to whom when geometry says now or never. Invite the citizen astronomers on purpose, give them calibrated targets and the software to reduce their data into something you will trust. In a good year, this is community outreach. In the right year, the wrong year, it is capacity. Then comes the hardest habit: decide when to decide. Write thresholds in peacetime when blood is cool. At what probability and lead time do you move from watch to warning? At what corridor width do you posture an interceptor? What confidence band triggers a ground drill in a city that will lose patience if you cry wolf twice? Codify. We act at 70% because waiting for a 95% kills the window. Put red/amber/green banners around those choices and train people to respect them even when their instincts itch. Build the doctrine so that no one has to invent courage at 3 a.m. Hardware is honesty. If an intercept is even remotely plausible, some craft must exist before the headline. Not concept art, steel, fuel, software that has already eaten its bugs. Stock quick launch scouts for flyby imaging and mass/shape estimates. Stock kinetic nudges with modular noses so you can swap sensor heads without rewriting flight code. Stock standoff energy deliverers if your laws and ethics allow them, and if they don't, argue now, in the light, not later, in the siren. Preposition a few in high orbits where Earth's gravity helps them pounce. Keep a few on the ground with clocks tattooed on their mission pages. Cache propellant where rendezvous is simplest. Build targeting algorithms that don't assume a calm, cooperative target. And practice. Practice until the phrase terminal guidance makes people smile instead of sweat. Because space is never only engineering. Build the governance that keeps the bolts turning. Draft a standing compact among nations that says who speaks, who flies, who pays, and who accepts liability if a life-saving attempt becomes a shower of lesser harms spread across borders. Create a shared fund with money that moves at the speed of physics, not appropriations. Establish a joint launch queue so the fastest available pad becomes a global asset when the corridor crosses oceans, not a bargaining chip. Write the waivers for export controls that will otherwise sit like sand in gears when you most need grease. Make the signatures now. Pens are slow when sirens are loud. Communication is a technology too. Pre-write the sentences that tell the world what non-zero means. Ban euphemism. Ban melodrama. Teach public officials and scientists to brief together, swapping the microphone without stepping on each other's verbs. Pre-build rumour control, a single page, updated hourly, that the press trusts because you earned that trust before you needed it. Train meteorologists, the most trusted science voices in many countries, to translate orbital odds into local sense, windows that might break, bays that might surge, hours that might be loud. Make maybe a word people can act on without feeling mocked if it turns into not this time. Drills are where doctrine becomes muscle. Run tabletops where an object like 3i Atlas shifts corridor twice in one day. Run live exercises that task telescopes. Push data through the pipeline, ping the radars, notify civil authorities, and then call it off midstream because the model improved. No fault, no shame, just learning. Put mayors, port captains, school principals, and power grid operators in the same room with trajectory fitters so they can trade realities. Practice the press conference that says, "We are changing our advice," and make it sound competent, not confused. Planetary defense doesn't end above the atmosphere. Harden the places where the shock will be felt. Install shatter-resistant film on windows in corridors most likely to see airbursts. Design shelters that protect against pressure waves as well as wind. Equip cities with sirens that have a vocabulary broader than storm and war. Stockpile what breaks and isn't sexy. Transformer spares, long-lead circuit boards, specialised valves, the odd gaskets for pumps that keep water honest. Build black start capacity so grids can climb out of holes without borrowing power they don't have. Lay backup communications like mesh and HF, so instructions can hop when satellites are crowded and cell towers nap. Keep medical caches mobile, with cold chain alternatives that don't shatter at the first long outage. The coasts need their own homework. Pre-model harbour resonances so local authorities know in advance which berths sing and which stay quiet. Mark vertical evacuation routes that a visitor can follow at a run. Train tug crews for panic. How to clear channels when AIS screens bloom with ships that should have left yesterday. Agree on standing maritime orders. When to cut moorings rather than lose crews. How to route tankers away from outgassing plumes that might poison air. Which ports become donors, which become sponges. Food is patience made visible. A dimmer year does not need to become a hungry one if we treat stocks like infrastructure. Rotate national reserves, so freshness is normal, not a scrambled exception. Diversify sources so a dusted monsoon belt does not become a fragile throat. Encourage indoor and protected agriculture not as tech theatre, but as boring resilience. Pre-arrange trade corridors that get priority when others close. Subsidise the unglamorous logistics that keep calories moving when everything else is stuck to the floor. Markets, too, can be taught calm. Build parametric insurance that pays on measured sky and ground indicators, not on months-long adjuster tours. Create temporary lending windows that keep small businesses from failing on a rumours schedule. Pre-agree on price stabilisation tools that don't punish farmers for acting rationally under uncertain skies. Economic resilience is not a speech. It is 1,000 tiny valves that prevent pressure from becoming shrapnel. None of this works if it is only for the rich. The corridor of risk does not read GDP tables. Share sensors, software, training, and launch capacity. Invest in regional hubs so help is near when near matters most. Translate playbooks into the languages people actually dream in. If one hemisphere becomes the final target first, the other must act like kin, not audience. Equity is not charity here, it is geometry. Fragmentation doesn't respect borders, and neither should our preparation. The quiet reward for all this work is that it pays off even when the sky spares us. More eyes find more ordinary near-Earth rocks that would have surprised someone's Tuesday. Faster pipelines make science quicker and cleaner. Hardened grids shrug at heat waves and ice storms with the same dignity they bring to airbursts. Ports that drill for rogue waves handle ordinary storms without turning the news into theatre. A world that can speak clearly about risk becomes harder to stampede and less profitable for those who would try. And if the day does come, if 3i Atlas rides its cold arithmetic all the way to our neighbourhood, and the corridor will not blink, the choice before the clock narrows but does not vanish. You launch the scout because pictures turn guesses into steering. You launch the nudge because centimetres per second now are miles later. You brief the cities in the corridor with sentences you practiced, and with options you pre-funded. You accept that some will accuse you of doing too much and others of doing too little, because leadership in physics is the art of disappointing the right people at the right time. You remember that fragments are not malice, they are outcomes, and you choose the outcome that civilization survives with bruises rather than the one it admires in a crater. Preparation is not paranoia, it is love, operationalized. Love for hospitals that open at dawn, for buses that arrive when they promised, for teachers who can teach because the windows stayed in, for ports that hum, for orchards that do not lose a decade to one bad week, for a sky that terrifies and teaches in equal measure. It is the stubborn refusal to offer Earth up as an unguarded final target. It is the recognition that, if the universe is going to test us, we might as well show our work. 3i Atlas is an exam we did not schedule. We can meet it as crammers, praying for a friendly question, or as students who built a habit of study, eyes tuned, hands steady, doctrine written, drills run, neighbours included. The clock will keep doing its job. Our job is to make sure that when it rings, the next chapter is one we wrote in advance. A world that moves quickly without panic, speaks clearly without spin, chooses action without certainty, and turns a line in the sky into a line of effort that protects the only blue world we have.